A very good evening to everybody and welcome to the 2021 Achates Philanthropy Foundation Symposium, All That's Been Revealed, curated by Javad Alipoor. My name's Paul Owens. I'm a trustee of the Achates Philanthropy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to be your host this evening for this event, which is called The Hidden Artist. The Achates Philanthropy Foundation is an independent charity which supports the cultural sector through innovative approaches, especially around diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we're also very interested in promoting the democratization of the arts. And this year's symposium, which is taking place over 5 evenings across this week, is really a chance for us to get together and have a space for quiet reflection on big questions like the role of the artist in society, and also to think about the changes that are happening around us, of which COVID-19 is but one, and also the changes we want to see in our own practice in the cultural sector and in the world at large. We really want you in the audience to be very much part of that discussion, along with our chair, our curator, and our panelists. And so we really do encourage you to submit your questions into the chat bar on the right. I think we're all becoming quite good at doing this in our various Zoom meetings. And one thing I would ask you specifically is to make sure that you post your questions to everyone rather than just to the panelists. It leads to a much livelier overall discussion. We also want this discussion to sort of continue to carry on beyond the event. And the handle you need to be aware of for that in social media terms is hashtag APF Symposium. Our event tonight's presented in collaboration with some fantastic partners, Battersea Arts Centre, Beat Freaks, Manchester International Festival, the National Centre for Writing, the People's Orchestra, Theatre 503, Rifco Theatre, Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Gallery, Stage Text and Union Chapel. We also, we're sponsored by Achates, and we're very proud to say that the trustees of the foundation have made donations to make sure it's possible to have live captions from Stage Text this evening, which is particularly appropriate because if you didn't know it, this week is actually a caption awareness week. So I want to hand you over to our chair tonight, who's also the curator of the overall symposium, Javad Alipoor. But just first a few words about Javad, for those of you who aren't familiar with him. Javad's a British-Iranian, Manchester-based, Bradford-built, I like that phrase, artist-writer, and he's the founding artistic director of the Javad Alipoor company. Javad's, the company takes stories beyond the stage through powerful multi-platform creations that explore the intersection of politics and technology in the contemporary world. Javad was a resident associate director of Sheffield Theatres from 17 to 18, associate director of Bradford's Theatre in the Mill from 2015 to 2017, and is an alumnus of the Arts Council's Changemakers programme. His plays include The Believers of Butt Brothers, Rich Kids, A History of Shopping Malls in Tehran, excellent, seen it, both published by Oberon, and Maid of Mannheim. And his, as most of you will know, his writing can be found in The Guardian, The Independent, and The Stage. So it gives me very great pleasure now to hand over to our chair, Javad Alipoor.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks, Paul, for that very kind introduction. So in terms of introductory remarks and that sort of thing, it feels like a really important space for us to be able to think about some quite sort of deep questions that we don't usually get the time and space to do in terms of how busy making work and our everyday lives are. The topic for tonight's discussion was one that came when I was speaking to colleagues at Achates, and we were thinking about a number of things with regards to the development of the sector, how people are making work, and so on. And we were thinking about, for someone like me, someone who's came into the sector and started making work in the early years of the first Cameron administration. One thing that I've seen through my engagement with the sector is is that the whole of the sector, all kinds of institutions and organizations have become more and more comfortable speaking about work in the context of its the most sort of consequential extrinsic values of making art. Whether that is the social effects of it, whether that is effects for mental health, for individuals, whether that's articulating the economic and financial case for the arts. And one of the things we started thinking about was to what extent it's still possible to articulate an intrinsic value of art, and how that may or may not interact with these other values. One thing for me was like that perhaps in some ways, there can be one challenge can be that there can be a weakening of position if all the value we place on things are extrinsic. One thinks, for instance, about the need of art to sometimes be confrontational or alienating, or in some ways, if I'm allowed to say so, antisocial to some degree, and how that might fit into these kinds of things. Further to that, often, insofar as we've spoken about an intrinsic value to art, often that's been something which has been, for a variety of reasons, tied up with a notion of elite art and culture. So those places that, if you like, are allowed to talk about the value of art itself have often been the elite forms, so-called, the elite artists, so-called, and the elite institutions. So that was kind of the provocation that, in a way, brought us here this evening. I am super excited to introduce the really, really amazing panelists we've got lined up for you all to speak on this evening. So the first person is Henna Zamurd-Butt, who is co-founder and co-director of Practice, formerly Barnett, a London-based cultural festival featuring social and political issues with an emphasis on global interconnection. Praxis, which launches in 2022, offers an experimental events program spanning fiction, journalism, poetry, theatre, and documentary. It builds from the work of Barnett, which ran from 2016 to 2020, showcasing the work of writers and creatives of colour. As a decolonial feminist scholar, Henna researches the politics of how the internet is imagined, governed, and experienced. Their PhD research at Goldsmiths College looks at how Global South youth and feminist activists frame internet access and governance in their work. Through Engage Inclusivity, Henna supports organisations in developing their engagement with social justice movements through research, training, and strategy development. Andrew Barnett has been director of the UK branch of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation since September 2007. As a strong believer in the value of collaboration, he played a major role in the establishment of the Making Every Adult Matter coalition, the campaign to end loneliness, and the international arts and homelessness movement called With One Voice. He was a founding director of the Social Innovation Exchange and founding council member of Collaborate KIC. He has introduced a more strategic and inquiry-based approach to the work of the UK branch and a tighter focus on specific issues. Current priorities are citizen engagement on climate action, valuing the ocean, and promoting the civic role of arts organisations. He's chair of trustees of the Church Urban Fund, which promotes faith-based social action and community cohesion across England, and a director and trustee of the Association of Charitable Foundations. For 8 years, Andrew was the senior independent member of Health Watch England, the statutory national consumer champion in health and social care. He previously served as chair of Deviate Physical Theatre, of Space Studios, group chair of People Can, a trustee of Ad Action, of the Forces in Mind Trust, and director of Yorkshire Metropolitan Housing, among other appointments. Andrew joined the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, where he held the post of Director of Policy Development and Communications. Andrew previously held senior roles at UK Sport, the National Consumer Council, HSBC Holdings, the Arts Council of England, and the Foyer Federation for Youth, as well as working for the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Homelessness and Housing Need. He was awarded an OBE in the 2021 New Year's Honours List for his contribution to social change. Nii Ayikwei Parkes is a Ghanaian British producer, editor, and writer who has won acclaim as a children's author, poet, broadcaster, and novelist. Winner of multiple international awards, including Ghana's ACRAG award, his novel Tale of the Blue Bird was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize, going on to win France's Prix Baudelaire and Prix Laure Bataillon in 2014. And his latest book of poems, The Geese, is a Poetry Book Society recommendation, was longlisted for the Rathbones Folio Prize and shortlisted for the Walcott Prize. He was the founding director of the ADU Centre for Creative Writing in Accra and is the founder of Flipped Eye Publishing, a leading small press. Nii serves on the board of World Literature Today and the Kane Prize, and has served as a judge for several literature prizes, including the Commonwealth Prize, the NSK Neustadt Prize, and the Harville-Secker Young Translators Prize. As a producer, he's the founder of the African Writers Evening series of talks and serves as the current producer of literature and talks at Brighton Festival. So I'm incredibly proud and excited to introduce those panelists. The format for this evening, as I'm sure you're aware, is each panelist will speak for 5 minutes first. I'll ask them some questions, and then of course there will be. Sorry, did I not introduce Henna?
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did.
Yeah, I thought I did. Sorry. There was a.
Don't do me again.
Yeah, no, very good. So then I think what's happened there is Henna is going to go first. So I will hand over the floor to you, Henna. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Caroline, for the invitation to join this great panel tonight, and really pleased to be speaking with you all. Javad, you smashed out those bios. That was a lot of material, a lot of achievements. So I really appreciated the provocation for the panel, and I've been thinking it over with relation to Barnett, which is now becoming praxis. And Barnett, it was founded in 2016, and at that time we were really focused on a literature festival for writers of colour. And the reason for it was we were speaking to writers, and they were saying, we're getting invited to these events, but we're few and far between, and often we're having to talk about things which aren't really related to our work, to our art. We're having to talk about diversity and inclusion and our community, and representing like millions of people that look a bit like us, and we're not really getting to talk about our work. So we created that space, and we ran it for the time that we did, and now we're relaunching Praxis, and this is a bit of a change because we're less focused on representation and more focused on, like Javad mentioned, creating these global solidarities around injustice and doing that through culture. And I'll get into a little bit more about that change hopefully later, but that's the perspective I'm coming at this discussion from, right? So we've gone from focusing on art for art's sake and maybe thinking about art in terms of other areas. So a few reflections that I've had from my years of running Barnett, I just want to go over them, and they come at this challenge towards art having intrinsic value from different directions. So the first thing I noticed is that different groups are having a say in what makes valuable art. Obviously, Barnett and lots of other movements for justice, for liberation, have looked for recognition for minoritized writers, and this activism has gone for a long time. I don't want to say it's anything new. But previous gatekeepers were able to define art in their own image, right? In that image, it was something that was apart from society, something that was essential and pure and sat away from people, high art, right? Now we're seeing voices from different social groups enter into that space and gain some recognition. Perhaps what the change that we're seeing is that they're just beginning to define art in their own image, and that includes different aspects. And of course, like even before, the idea that art was sitting away from society was a nonsense. We see the example of, for example, fine art, which is supposed to be, the apex of art for no function but itself, and that, it plays a role within financial markets and investment. So even then, it's not supposed to have a function, but it can do. So the second thing I know is the arts are changing. I teach media and comms students at Goldsmiths. They're filmmakers, they're podcasters, they're influencers, they're photographers. I mean, they make art day in, day out. They perform, they do comedy, they do everything. And this is a part of the mediatization of life. And by that, I mean the increasing prevalence of media getting into life, which has its own kind of role to play. But it has changed the arts. And I think perhaps we've been a bit slow to respond to this and slow to include these areas into our discussions. And actually with Praxis and with Barnett, that's something that we have had to change, because we started out being a festival for writers of colour, and then they were coming to us and they were saying, well, yeah, I write, but I also produce photographs and I also produce paintings, and people were coming with so many different forms of expression, and we didn't want to silo them. So we started as a festival for writers of colour, and then Barnett actually became a festival for creatives of colour that were bringing loads of different practices to the space. And then the third observation I make is that, and this, everyone will be familiar with this, money for the arts has been made really scarce, right? For our festival, getting funding has always been a massive challenge. And what we've noticed is that where funders meet those who are delivering projects, and the different expectations kind of come together, there is always a distortion as you try to kind of fit with each other in some way. And that distortion at the point of interaction, that often sees different expectations packaged in with the delivery of the arts program in our case. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. Sometimes, you know, these are very lofty ambitions with really important goals. But when we see ourselves having to fulfill these social roles that have been kind of deserted by other aspects of politics, right? There is something at play with how we're having to consider our work. And at the same time, alongside this, there's this constant pressure to demonstrate like a quantitative impact to our work as well. And that changes the relations around the way in which these arts are produced too. Just before I finish, I mean, I think that there is a conversation to be had around this. I think from our perspective as Barnett going into praxis, it's about arts institutions recognizing that we can't be apolitical, we have to be political within this conversation. And to be apolitical means to kind of this continuing trend of like seeing art spaces kind of ground into other areas and the space just shrinking. So I hope that that's the kind of direction we can continue to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Henna. That felt like some, you know, a super productive place to start. So thank you. Going through the list of people as I introduced them in bios, I'd like to go to Andrew next, if that's okay.
Thank you, Javad, and thank you, Henna, too, for stimulating us and perhaps even provoking us. I want to, so I'll come on to the work of the civic role of arts organisations, an inquiry we launched in the last decade, which is now a programme of work at the Gulbenkian. But I want to talk about sort of why we launched it in the first place. And in part, it's a sort of it's a poke at this debate about whether the arts has intrinsic or instrumental value, and it was in about sort of 2012, I think, that I sort of thought to myself that actually it was that debate's a bit of a rabbit hole, and that intrinsic really means that there's a whole load of values that are quite difficult to substantiate, but they're there. It's not that there's something necessarily inherent, and instrumental means that you're sort of deploying them for particular social goods. And I just thought this is quite dangerous as a sort of debate, and that we should just sort of steer away from that. I mean, I have to say at the same time, I was quite worried about the prevailing discourse around access and participation, a parody for which is sort of really particularly for people from different backgrounds to my own, you know, they would enjoy more of my culture if only they got enough of it, which I was really uncomfortable about. And I thought that we needed to push beyond these rabbit holes, the parody and the rabbit hole. And that's why we launched the inquiry into the civic role of arts organisations. I should say I've got some form around when it comes to thinking about the value of the arts. I was at the Arts Council actually in charge of making the case for the economic value of the arts shortly after the Gulbenkian had funded John Myersco's rather seminal study into the economic value of the arts. And so I'm well used to sort of deploying these arguments, and it's quite interesting that it may well be that the economic value of the arts is an argument that's deployed again in order to address what Henna says is about the need for government investment. It may be that the economic value or the value to particular parts of the country, indeed its value to leveling up, is something which we will all need to lean on. But we ran this inquiry, and the reason why we called it civic was because I sensed that there was something that was quite difficult to encapsulate, but really was about citizens, community, something about locality, which is all conjured up by that term civic, and plays into a feeling that actually change is brought about both by innovations in the sort of in the slipstream, but also changing narrative. And we ran this inquiry and undertook 2 literature reviews, 40 case studies, or actually 80 now, 4 artist commissions, range of consultations, and 31% of arts organisations said that the civic role was part of their vocabulary, which I think is quite an interesting statistic. And 75% said they plan to play a greater role in the future. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot of what the results were, and then tell you just a bit about the programme of work and where that leads and where it might lead and how it's pertinent to this discussion. So in terms of what we discovered that there were different motivations. So there are people who, for whom arts for social change is their driving motivation. Others, and you might think of sort of 60 million artists, is sort of, it's about everyday creativity. Others think about cultural democracy, arts for individual development, or arts with a focus on the vulnerable or people who are disadvantaged. So sort of arts for mental health or health. There's a range of motivations. All of the organizations we analysed were working at different levels. So some at the very individual level, some at the community level, and some at a sort of, if you like, local to global. All of them were promoted to excellence, and I think that's really important. They all had really inspiring leaders. In each case, people and communities were at the heart of their work, and that there were really strong relationships between organizations of different sorts. Another point was, I think there's this range of different sort of practices. So we call it sort of version 1, which was sort of producer-driven arts. Version 2 is where people go out and get people to come in, and version 3 is co-designed. And I think there's something really important here about where does co-design fit, and how does that perhaps release more value. And finally, on what we found definition really difficult to encapsulate, more about principles rather than definition. And actually, metaphor proved to be really, really compelling. So we produced the metaphors of colleges, places of learning, town halls, places of discussion and debate, parks, public spaces, temples, places which give sort of meaning and solace, and home, safety and belonging. And it's since we did the inquiry that we began a programme of work, in part to influence the Arts Council's strategy, where relevance and inclusivity, again, are those values or are they principles? Those investment principles will be very important. I was really hoping that we could stop arguing amongst ourselves between those who are sort of pushing the case for cultural democracy on the one hand, or creative education, or art for social change, and see this as a more holistic lens. And we're running an award for civic arts organisations, so I'm really keen to see what comes through from that. I guess what I'm saying is that this is a sort of wrapper. It's a way of describing things in a way that will motivate others without being too explicit or specific about the precise impacts that happen. It's about being able to, if you like, instrumentalize, but in a loose way, allowing the emergent, which I think is important, and allowing for all of those things which are sort of ambiguous and quite tricky to track. I'm just looking for a quote now, which I'm finding difficult to find. I'll leave you with a quote from François Matarazzo, who I think sort of summed it up really, when he said that, talked about art's ability to ferry us between different shores of understanding is vital in a public space dominated by communications that are reductively simple at best, or simply deceptive. When political divisions are daily widened by words of fear and hatred, the complexity of artistic statements are necessary, vital fire breaks. I think that's quite interesting in terms of sort of encapsulating what we might mean about the civic or the value of the arts, which is both avoids the rabbit holes of is it this about the intrinsic or the inherent, and moves us beyond access and participation, which I think is a bit tired.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Some like really stimulating stuff there as well. That was brilliant. I'd like to, in terms of the final initial speech from a panelist, I'd like to turn to Nii Ayikwei. How you doing? Thanks, man.
I'm good, thank you. Well, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be in this company. Thanks for your thoughts, Henna and Andrew. Henna runs, or used to run, what was Bare Lit, where I gave a talk about the literature industry called By Design, in which I suggested that the notion that the industry discriminates by accident is a falsehood, because if the essential structure that exists is to give advantage to a particular way of life, then it will, just by its existence, discriminate. And I think we fall in the same category here. I think if we already are in a system that valorizes and commercializes art, then the horse has kind of bolted. But before we even talk about intrinsic value, I think we have to start with how we define art itself. And the global construction of art as we know it, the dominant construction, is very much to do with elitism. The notion of art being the sole occupation of someone, again, is to do with that. So the initial consumers of art on a global scale were wealthy people. And the notion of the poor artist used to be the person who was discovered as talented, brought to the party. And essentially, if you look at the history of artists who've been discovered, if they were poor, very soon, because they were wanted in certain areas of society, they had to be dressed up and packaged to be the artists in these environments, or they had to have wealth. Or if you were in the country, in order to be recognized, you had to come to the city. You come to the city, you have to pay certain things, and therefore you need to make a certain amount of money. How does intrinsic value, even if we accept the definitions of art, how does intrinsic value survive in such a system? And I think that where we've moved to is where the arts are supported by foundations. You know, in order to get anything close to finding intrinsic value, because otherwise then the artist is producing to eat to some degree. And I think even with funding, there's a conflict between funding and intrinsic value, because most funding asks artists to say why their work is important and what their aims are going to be. There are very few funding opportunities that don't have that. The Jerwood Fellowship in the UK that's just finishing required you to show a plan, and you needed tangible endorsements, or you had to collaborate or be mentored. I think recently the Mellon Foundation in the US has launched Let's Raspberry Request, where they will give $25,000, where there's no question asked. But $25,000, I mean, if art is your sole employment, is not going to do much to you. So I think the only real funding opportunity that I know of in the world that doesn't ask you to prove anything and just gives the money because you are supposed to be, you know, an artist of originality, insight, and potential is the MacArthur's Fellow Program, which gives $625,000. Just gives it to you 5 installments over 5 years. And that's the closest thing to where you can say that an artist might be able to explore art purely for its intrinsic value. So I think, you know, that's the world in which we are living. And I think because of the valorization and commercialization, what we do get is, rather than, to my mind, and probably closer to the African conception of art, which is why sometimes people don't understand all the things that were looted, that have become, you know, high-priced things that are not being returned to people, and people are being told you have to store it in a certain way before we return it to you. the African conceptions of art that I know from West Africa is art is both functional and beautiful. And this is why for many of us from West Africa, adornment is important, because part of the art is what we carry with us. And I think in the way that art would have evolved, I think without the intervention of the colonial encounter, would have been closer to what Freud talks about when he talks about the uncanny, where the familiar becomes strange, in that the familiar becomes art. So it's just a slight shift, and that is art. And I think that when we are in a valorized system, what tends to happen is people curate or cultivate difference or innovation so that the art then becomes force. It's like, these are the most amazing, most creative artists, but actually they're being very conscious about what they're using to be creative. And I mean, we could mention people like Picasso, you know, deliberately looking back to African art to influence, to change his style so that he could stand out. You know, maybe he did it for himself, but there's also the sense of, hey, I need to be different from my peers if art is our employment, our sole employment. So yeah, I mean, I am interested in the notion of how we define art in the first place, and then how we look at intrinsic value in a world where intrinsic value is kind of the horse that has bolted. Thanks.
Thank you to all the panelists, and that was, again, I feel like there was a whole bunch of stuff that everyone spoke to in there, which felt generative, productive, all kinds of things like sort of you know, to coin the cliche, all kinds of synapses firing. I have a couple of questions that I just wanted to throw out to the panel, if that's okay. And I know that, you know, folks in the audience, if you keep throwing yours across, we'll have some time for audience questions as well. One thing that I thought, so I think start as you mean to go for the heavy duty question. I think one of the things that we've kind of like circled around in different ways through everyone's initial speech really is that, like, you know, there is something that is, there's a lot of complications over talking about art in the first place, which seems like an academic exercise, but if we're going to talk about the value of it, that seems a pretty pressing question. There are, in some ways, the word art feels a little bit like a word like freedom or science, in the sense that, like, it could cover over sort of false friendships in that linguistic terms. You know, in the sense that it actually can name very many different practices, social relations, ways of being, blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, what I'm asking is then, apart from in terms of how we organize together, how we fund, how we think about a sector and so on, like, talking about a value of art, is that doing any real lifting for us as an idea? And anyone who wants to speak to that, please go for it.
Can I go first? So I think the answer may well be maybe, but I sort of want to think about what Nii said earlier on, which was about it's like the commercialization of art, and I completely understand. And you know, we see these examples of, you know, people who have created something which is highly ephemeral, disappears, people paying huge amounts of money for it. It's all, frankly, they're taking the piss. But then there's something about, so that, I mean, the reality is that you know, art can be made that from an individual, but it's really most meaningful when there's a relationship with others. And the reality is that in order to have a relationship with others, you need to have at least a common language, if not a common currency. And money is an international way of understanding things and understanding the values that we place on things, given that, you know, things are assumed to be finite. So I think this whole thing about commercialization needs to be put in the context that money really is just a common language and a way of expressing our individual values to it, and so yeah, so that's my point really.
Thank you, Henna or Nii. Sorry, Nii, we didn't speak before. Is it Nii Ayikwei or just Nii? What's the best way to?
Normally Nii Ayikwei. Most people don't say it well, but you say it beautifully. So when people don't say it well, I just say they should say Nii, just so that the murder is less.
Go. Nii Ayikwei or Henna, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I mean, again, we come back to foundational ways of looking at the world. The notion that money is a universal way of understanding things, again, comes with the commercialization of human bodies, because it wasn't the way in which things were done in every community, society. The fact that it is universal now is also on the back of oppression and exploitation. So yes, I mean, I agree that it is now, which is why I said the horse has bolted. It's very difficult to go back to what anything would have been, because you've also broken the evolutionary cycles of other things. For instance, the problem that we have in the environment right now, literally, if we said everyone in the West should live like people live healthily in West Africa, the consumption of beef would go down by like 90%, and half of our problems are gone. But can you ask them to do that? Yes, you can. Will they do it? I don't know. So that's if we talk as though all of these exploitative and disruptive things haven't happened, then we can't ever understand what might have been or what can be. Because really, if we want to look at the intrinsic value of art, then we have to question more than just art itself, but the system and world within which it resides.
Thank you. Henna.
So yeah, I would definitely echo Nii's point about the idea of money coming with cultural baggage. It is not a neutral idea. It creates relations around it of its own type. And yeah, Nii spoke to that. So and what I would add is, I try to steer away from universalities, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that universalities and the idea of universalities is rooted within Western Enlightenment thinking. And if we want to think about art, even that, there is no universality there available to us. We need to kind of explore where that idea might come from, and there will always be an enforcement of certain more privileged, more vocal, more powerful groups that will take control over that narrative. Rather, we need to think about creating complexities in how we consider art and exploring those complexities, acknowledging that there is multiple ways of conceiving of art. That is where the direction of travel that we need to go into. But of course, when we try and move towards efficiency, commercialization, that is always kind of, it's like has a centrifugal effect on the conversation. And we're actually like we're centralizing the conversation. We're going back to that universality. And so you see a push and pull away from that. And resistance movements are doing a great job. And activists are doing a great job, and minoritized artists are doing a great job of trying to create that conversation. But when, as Nii Ayikwei put it, that the resources are so limited for people to do that, that the pressure is often, and like this is what my point was originally around, a lack of resources. And when you're trying to see funding for projects, there's this push and pull where you want to take the direction of creating multiplicities, but at the same time, there are these demands that are trying to bring you back to these straight lines, right? So this is the challenge that we're dealing with.
Thank you, Henna. Thank you. You cut out for me there for a little at the end, I think. There's a sort of thank you.
I was going to say I lost the end of your last sentence.
I don't know if you could repeat your last sentence for us, please.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just saying that the challenge that we're dealing with now is that with funding and resources being made so scarce, and with so many demands being placed upon them that are kind of along certain lines, even though we're trying to create multiplicities in our activism and amongst all these artists, we're pulled into these like centrifugal forces, so that there's very narrow definitions of art, and it's like a tightrope that you have to walk in order to get the resources to make things happen.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you to all of you for those responses. It seems like there's some interesting threads coming out around, for a start, like those binaries that I was maybe setting up at the top of the thing, like the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic, and the distinction between social and financial. It's interesting that these things are being problematized a little bit. I sort of come down between you two guys on those things. So on one level, I'm aware that I grew up speaking a language, Persian, that has no indigenous word for art in it. I'm aware that the word theatre was imported into Persian and so on, but I am hopeless enough of a romantic to want to think that I share something in common with, you know, various other artists across the world and so on. So moving to questions from the audience. One question is, in terms of this, what we perceive as the civic role of the arts, or this could also be true, I suppose, of the political and indeed kind of caring roles of the arts. Do we think that this is primarily something that we should conform society, which I suppose means support society as it is, or challenge society?
So can I go again and say that, I mean, it can actually be either. So it can go with the grain, and I think that's something which I think the notion of the civic allows, but it also can be challenging. And the reality is that it's able to navigate it's able to navigate this ambiguous space. That's really what I think I've been trying to do with the notion of the civic.
Yeah, I would say one of the interesting things about art is its effect on its viewer or listener or reader, whatever sensory sort of bridge there is, cannot be predicted. You know, there is a work of art that will absolutely shock everyone, and one person will stand in front of it and start laughing, like hysterically. So that is what art is. You can't predict. So I think what art does is it breaks the cycle of our solo movement within the world. So while we're moving within the world, we're in our own heads. What art can do is to break us out of that. And there is a value to that, because it is easy to get lost, whether it's in euphoria or sadness. You know, it is easy to get lost in your own world. And there can be positive, but a lot of the time there can be destructive, you know, repercussions from that. And so it's important that there are things that alert us to the fact that the world lives and changes and has other perspectives. And that's what art does.
Javad, when you spoke that question, I lost your sound for a minute. So could you say it again?
Sorry, I feel like we've the question was about, I was just what do you call it, like following the twists and turns about Andrew and Nii Ayikwei.
You're talking about a civic value, right? Which is what I thought
I think
the question I thought I responded to.
I think the question was, does it need to conform or confront social norms?
That's exactly right. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, like I think it's relational, like you've both said. It needs to do everything that it needs to do within that relationship. And to go off what Nii Ayikwei was just saying about it's being unpredictable, that's actually one thing that I was thinking for, because that's an aspect that we've actually lost, because as we move towards a society that is kind of allergic to the risk of maybe losing money or not making returns on artistic investment, we're looking at kind of big data being marshaled to try and like predict what is going to be successful and what is going to get the most eyes on it. And that might not necessarily be what is going to be the most useful or productive for society, and who can predict that. But and obviously the clearest example of that is something like Netflix, where they have all of the data about when you're viewing something, where you stop, where you play it again, where you log off, all of that. So that's being used now to generate new forms of art. And so that unpredictable relational aspect is being lost, and the degree of control that our producers are able to exercise over their audiences is really something of concern, I would say.
Thank you. So I think this is probably taking us roughly up to our last question from the audience, which is sort of building on that last question, I suppose, is there's two questions that have come in, two or three that are sort of seeming on a similar sort of tilt of things. So forgive me, I'm going to try and pull out, you know, a kind of composite from those. So there are a lot of pressures and challenges on artists at the minute, especially, you know, one of the phrases I'm seeing here is like late stage capitalism, or I suppose the pressures of the kind of the government we have now and the way society is working. So within those pressures, how is it possible for an artist to remain politically cogent and coherent and kind of combative and radical? And is it even really possible for art to be apolitical in the first place?
I can speak to this and say, no, it's not. Absolutely not. Whatever perspective you're coming from, you're always bringing your own assumptions, you're always bringing your own perspective on the world, and therefore it is political. But from what I said at the beginning, it's whether you make those politics clear or whether those politics are kind of hidden from view, and more about the way that you frame perhaps your vision of the world. And so if you're in a position of power, you're able to control that narrative, and you're able to say, you know, this is how the world is, and I see it like that, and therefore, and because your kind of image is circulating so freely, you'll be able to control that conversation. That is as political as something that is very coming from maybe a subalternized or minoritized perspective, which is more overt in its politics because it has to be, because it's challenging the status quo, right? So they're equally political, only one it's visible to us and one it's not. And when it's not visible to you, the first work we have to do as activists is to make that visible, then make those power relations visible so that you can actually be like, okay, this is going on, and maybe I don't agree with it. And yeah, that's what we're trying to do in our work.
So allow me to explore this. So it seems to me that that given that everything exists in a context, it's impossible for things to be apolitical. So there's always a context. The question then is whether, you know, artists of or one artist or another is either complicit or coerced, or indeed what is the sort of observational role of an artist in trying to like stand back and allow us to read the context for ourselves.
Just to be clear, the context of the art, or
the context within which we live and within which art is made.
Well, I mean, unless the artist lives with us, it's very difficult for them to control that. And I think, you know, that's why artist is political, regardless of whether it seeks to be or not, because unless the art is a clear mirror where the viewer is looking at themselves, then it's political. But even the notion of a clear mirror is also political, because it might be saying, hey, look at yourself. You might be art. So, you know, I think the notion of, I think the label of political art is used to silence, rather than it being useful for anything else. I think it's used to silence, so that one artist or another might think, oh, maybe I'm pushing too many boundaries, or that type of thing, or that people might think that that artist is pushing boundaries and not support them, and that kind of thing. But I think it's a label that's used as a kind of pejorative, rather than you know, one piece of art being more political than another.
Okay, so allow me to take this to on a bit. So it may be that we're thinking about art as a product, whereas actually I think that we might also want to think of it as a process, and that the process itself is in itself explorative, and that is completely legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, I think of all art as process, because even what you think of as product is in process because it's being consumed. The consumption is part of the process of the product. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. I've got some, I know we're sort of pushing at time a little bit. I wonder whether I could ask, I've got some individual questions for everyone, one each. I wonder if I could ask those in a relatively brief and timely fashion. So Henna, one question for you is, how do you feel about the shift in model from bare lit to praxis and the choices that have been involved in that? I'm aware I said, you know, timely and briefly, and I've just asked you a big old question about the important organization that you run, but deal with it how you can, mate.
How do I feel about it? I feel really positive about it, because I feel like I've been involved with politics around representation and inclusion of Black and minoritized groups since 2013. And I have and myself and my co-director Mend Marawani, we found that it's been frustrating because we've been chipping away at representation, but there's wider systemic issues here at play that we need to be tackling and discussing. And often we're finding that the representation conversation is actually not really helping. And people are asking for representation, but not really considering where representation can sometimes even be complicit within injustices when we grow our visor and look at the world or look at society in a broader spectrum, right? So these kinds of processes were not sitting right with us. And so for me, I feel really positive about this change. I think it's a natural change. And I think others, my peers and our peers who have been through this process and been through these politics are beginning to see similar issues with what we've been advocating for and beginning to move in this direction. So I think it's important, and I'm all for it and I'm excited.
Thank you. Nii Ayikwei, there's a specific question for you. Again, this is with all of you, I'm going to go, brief and timely, but I'm asking you these big bombshell questions that refer to stuff. But yeah, well, there's a question in the chat for you, which was about whether or not you could speak for us about the relationship between what you spoke about with art and the violent, perhaps what can be perceived as a violence inherent in what can be called universal value. The person in the chat was drawing a parallel between that and your recent, I think, article in the LA Review of Books called "The Thief Cannot Prescribe," and just wondering if you had any thoughts that you could share about that.
Well, I mean, I think I think both the article and perhaps what I discussed in the 5 minutes are related to the idea that we're now judging we're judging things from several cultures that do not originate in the West with a vocabulary and structure and logic system that is in the West, and it's not helpful, and it continues to be violent for the people of Benin because they have to live knowing that things that are important to them spiritually and historically, and some of which may not have survived, but would have been important in a process, to reference Andrew, in a process of developing new art and exploring new ways of kind of presenting themselves in the world, because they wouldn't necessarily have been labeled as art. All of those things have been broken, and yet things will not be returned to them. And the thief effectively is trying to say, we can't give it back to you unless you have, for instance, an air-conditioned room, or, it has to go to this person or that person. And that's what the article is about. So I think it's similar to what I was saying about the definition of art, etc. Yeah, so there's some relationship, but I think all it's saying is, what Henna was saying is that we need to be aware that there is a wider world of ways in which we can talk about art and its value and society and what's valuable in society.
Thank you. Thank you. And a final question for Andrew, just is about, obviously, when you were speaking, you kind of problematized the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic for us tonight, and a whole bunch of other things. In terms of that broad question about the civic role of art, is there anything that you kind of envisage as being the thing that's missing in terms of its articulation, or a missing piece in that jigsaw that might be kind of on the horizon?
So I think it is about the relevance to particular communities, and that can be geographic or interest groups, or there's something. I think it is about, in that conversation, that nexus between the artist and the audience, and co-design really takes us out of that place to something where there's a genuine relationship, and beyond that notion of art being something that is then done to or seen by people, but something which is of, for, and by.
Thank you, and thanks for those remarks at the end to everyone. It's been a great chat, a real pleasure to be talking to you all, and there's some lovely comments in the chat and everything. So thanks again. I'll hand back over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Rag.
Great. Thanks, Javad, for your chairing. And thanks to our three brilliant speakers, Henna, Nii, Andrew, for your insights and grappling with some, I think, actually really big questions to which there are no simple answers. But I think Henna said, you know, there is a sort of progression in thinking overall, I think, in the UK anyway. I certainly see it in my work. But anyway, and also thanks to everyone for their questions and comments. Before I close, I just want to remind you that, you know, it's Thursday, tomorrow's Friday, tomorrow's our last session, and it's called The Lives of Artists. And we'll be asking important questions about how we can create a collaborative culture of dialogue that seeks to improve working conditions for everyone in the cultural sector. Massive issue, particularly brought you know, a light shone on that over the last 2 years. Javad is going to be joined by Kuli Thiarai, who's the director of Leeds 2023, theatre technician Andrew Glassford, and the director, producer, choreographer, and Vogue house mother Darren Pritchard. So I hope you can join us all for that. And just a reminder to everyone also that all of our 5 events from this year's symposium are going to be available on YouTube for free. So that just leaves me a few words just to say thanks to our partners who I listed earlier. Thanks to Stage Text for our live captions. Thanks to Achates. And most of all, thanks again to Javad for curating the overall symposium. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.